Welcome to the world of Dreamside Traveler. Here, beneath the soothing sound of gentle rain, we journey through time and space, uncovering the mysteries of the past and diving into the most captivating pages of human history. This place is created for those who love exploring the world in the quiet of evening, for those who value peace while yearning to discover something new before sleep. If you enjoy what you're hearing, please give this video a like. It helps other people find our stories. Help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers in our club of nighttime history lovers. And the Dreamside Traveler channel will become your faithful guide to sleep. We're constantly adding new stories for your peaceful evenings. And if you have ideas about which historical topics interest you, or simply want to share your thoughts, leave comments below the video. I'm genuinely curious to know what inspires you. Now close your eyes. Feel this gentle rain outside your window. Allow yourself to relax. Our journey begins right now. In the heart of what many call the Dark Ages, medieval Europe was not just a time of knights, castles, and romantic quests. It was also a period of suffering, superstition, and strict social rules. Fashion was not just a matter of style. It became a powerful tool that showed status, morality, and identity. But many of the beauty standards of the time were not only uncomfortable, they were truly dangerous. Imagine a world where looking noble meant looking sick. Pale skin, thin bodies, long foreheads, and tight waists were seen as signs of beauty and high birth. These were not just trends, they were expectations. And to meet them, people made great sacrifices. As one English chronicler named John Trevisa wrote in the 1400s, people have become so obsessed with how they look that they have forgotten how to live. Among the nobility, who didn't need to work with their hands, fashion became a way to stand out from the working class. In Italy and France, wealthy women used tight belts and early forms of corsets to shape their bodies. This began as early as the 13th century. They would squeeze their waists so tightly that, as one writer named Marguerite of Avignon remembered, some women fainted just after the third curtsy during court events. The goal was to have a small waist and a straight back, but the results were far from graceful. Organs were pushed out of place. Breathing became hard. Backs became bent. And during pregnancy, this fashion could even kill both the mother and the baby. Yet women still followed the trend, seeing it as proof of elegance and strength. Men, too, were not spared. In the 1500s, a strange kind of shoe became popular across Europe. They were called poulings. These shoes had long, pointed toes that sometimes reached half a meter in length. Imagine trying to walk with a stick tied to the tip of your foot. In England, King Edward IV tried to stop commoners from wearing such shoes by limiting the length to 6 inches. But nobles wore longer, fancier ones anyway. To make the shoes stay up, people tied the ends of the points to their knees with strings. This made walking even more awkward. People fell often. One story tells of a young knight in Normandy who tripped on stairs during a dance and died from the fall, all because of his stylish shoes. Women's fashion was just as extreme on the head. Some noble ladies wore tall hats called hennins. These looked like cones or towers made of silk and wire. Some were as tall as a person's upper body. These hats showed wealth and purity, but they also caused headaches, sore necks, and sometimes even cuts from the pins holding them together. In the French and Burgundian courts, noblewomen had to walk slowly and carefully just to balance their heads. Fashion also changed the skin. Pale faces were seen as beautiful. People believed it showed that you didn't work in the sun like a farmer, but getting that pale look wasn't easy or safe. Women used creams made with white lard, vinegar, and even arsenic. These poisons made the skin look white, but over time they caused peeling, burns, and even death. A French record from the middle of the 15th century talks about a noblewoman known as Lady Detriment, who lost all her teeth and went blind after using a special silver-based cleansing paste. In cities like Venice and Florence, even teenage girls used face creams made with mercury, not knowing how toxic they were. Another painful custom was removing body and facial hair. To make the forehead look high and noble, women pulled out their eyebrows and even the hair at the front of their head. Sometimes they used hot tongs to do this. Infections and open wounds were common, but a tall forehead was seen as a sign of intelligence and purity. So the pain was accepted as part of being beautiful. Eye makeup was no safer. In Italy and Spain, upper-class women used powders made from coal and antimony to make their eyes look deep and dark. These powders could cause serious eye infections. In some cases, people even went blind. Smells were also part of the beauty ritual. Since daily washing was rare, perfumes were used to hide body odor. These perfumes were made with amber, musk, and strong resins. Women rubbed them behind their ears, into their hair, and even on private parts. But under the summer sun, some of these substances became toxic. They caused rashes and fainting. Even clothes themselves were dangerous. Long dresses with dragging trains collected dirt, animal waste, and trash from the streets. In cities like Paris and Naples, with no proper sewage system, these dresses carried disease. During the Black Death in the late 1300s, the church ordered that dresses should be shortened. But once the plague ended, long trains returned to fashion. Men's clothing had its own hazards. In Germany and Switzerland, inspired by the age of chivalry, noblemen began adding metal plates to their everyday outfits. These included vests with steel or bronze parts and leather jackets with studs. Some even wore ceremonial armor. It looked impressive, but it was heavy and hot. One record speaks of a knight named Friedrich from Basel who died of heat stroke during a hunt because he refused to take off his decorative breastplate. Perhaps the saddest part of this beauty craze was the rise of extreme thinness as a sign of spiritual purity. Young girls from religious families were praised for not eating. The idea was that the thinner they were, the closer to angels they became. One Franciscan nun once wrote, "I felt joy as my skin turned pale like lilies." But in the same letter, she spoke of fainting spells and seeing visions from hunger. Medical care at the time was very basic. Most people didn't know why their bodies were in pain. Some thought it was punishment from God. Others were treated with bloodletting or prayers. The the suffering caused by fashion was rarely questioned. It was seen as part of one's duty, especially for the noble classes. In the end, medieval fashion was more than just clothing. It shaped how people moved, how they looked, how they felt, and even how they suffered. It was a kind of social theater, a ritual where pain was turned into beauty and beauty into a kind of power. As the French knight Geoffroy de Charny once wrote, "Great is the one who knows how to suffer beautifully." In the heart of the Middle Ages, medicine was not the science we know today. It was a strange, often brutal blend of ancient philosophies, spiritual beliefs, and sheer desperation. Healing rarely meant relief. It often meant pain, suffering, and sometimes a quicker path to death. At the time, people believed that the human body was ruled by four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness, they thought, stemmed from an imbalance among these fluids. And so, one of the most common treatments was bloodletting. Doctors opened veins with knives or used leeches, thinking it would restore harmony to the body. They bled patients for everything, from fevers to headaches to madness. But often, it left people weaker, dizzy, prone to infection, or simply dead. This practice wasn't rare or limited. In some monasteries, monks had scheduled monthly bloodletting sessions, not because they were sick, but to cleanse the spirit. Even royalty was not spared. The young King Henry VIII nearly died after being bled 3 times in a row to treat a simple cold. In even darker corners of medicine, there was trepanation, the drilling of holes in the skull. The idea was to let out evil spirits or relieve pressure. No anesthesia, no sterilization, just raw pain. Some skulls found in archaeological sites show signs of healing, meaning the patient survived. Others, no such luck. Many died from shock or infection, their final moments filled with agony. Mental illness was often seen as demonic possession. To cure it, doctors sometimes poured boiling water over the patient's head or suspended them upside down in icy rivers, hoping to shock the demons away. A more scientific remedy included a horrifying mix of belladonna, hemlock, and opium, stirred into wine. It could cause hallucinations, paralysis, or death. But death was seen as purification of the soul. The influence of religion was immense. Sickness was considered divine punishment. Healing began with confession, prayer, and self-flagellation. During the darkest plague years, groups of people wandered from town to town, whipping themselves in the streets, hoping their pain would earn God's forgiveness. Monks chanted psalms in ancient languages they barely understood, while burning hair and driving out demons with ritual beatings. The bubonic plague brought unimaginable horror. Plague doctors wore bird-like masks filled with herbs, believing it would filter out deadly air. They lanced buboes, those swollen, infected lumps, with knives, rubbed ash and vinegar into wounds, and forced patients to drink molten gold or human urine. In a German monastery, doctors placed burning coals inside the rectum of plague victims to evaporate the death. But perhaps the most disturbing practices involved human remains. Powder made from crushed Egyptian mummies was considered a miracle cure for stomach pain or internal bleeding. The French King Francis I regularly drank wine laced with mummy powder. In London, apothecaries sold skull pills made from the bones of executed criminals. This wasn't folklore, it was recorded, approved medicine. To treat syphilis, doctors turned to mercury. Patients inhaled the vapor, rubbed it on their skin, or had it introduced rectally. One popular technique, known as mercurial fumigation, involved sealing the patient in a tent and filling it with mercury fumes. Hair fell out. Teeth crumbled. Organs failed. But as the sweat poured from their bodies, doctors believed sin was pouring out too. Toothaches were blamed on tiny worms said to live in teeth. Instead of removing the tooth, healers poured boiling tar into the cavity or pressed red-hot metal to the gums. In rural areas, ash from dead cats was rubbed into the gums. In Wales, an herbal tonic made from dog brains was considered a trusted remedy. Epilepsy was another mystery. It was treated with fresh, still warm blood drawn from the necks of executed criminals. People gathered at the gallows, cups in hand, to catch the blood as it dripped. Blood was sacred, seen as a vessel of the soul and a source of vitality. Some aristocrats even paid executioners to supply it regularly. In women's medicine, danger lurked at every step. Infertile women were given enemas of honey and charred swallow feathers. Pregnant women had leeches placed on their wombs to balance the humors. During difficult childbirths, midwives used a hooked blade to cut the baby out, tearing the mother's body in the process. If the child died in the womb, long metal tools were used to pull the remains out. Mothers often died too. Even minor wounds could turn fatal. Germs were unknown, and antiseptics were not in use. Bandages were soaked in urine or wine. Sometimes, powdered frogs were sprinkled into open cuts. In one recorded case, a baron's leg wound festered so badly that monks burned out the infection with a glowing hot sickle. He died within 3 days from blood poisoning. Other remedies were just as bizarre. People were advised to swallow live spiders wrapped in bread to cure fevers. Snake bites were treated by eating live frogs. Madness. That required the consumption of raw lizards. Illness was believed to be something that could be absorbed by another living being. And by swallowing it, the patient might be healed. Medieval medicine wasn't just a lack of science, it was a ritual of suffering. There were no patient rights, no informed consent, and no recovery plans. Survival was random. Pain was seen as divine, and in this world of bone drills, bloodletting, and holy punishment, life was fragile, but the soul, that, they believed, was eternal. In the medieval world, the idea of cleanliness had little to do with soap, water, or hygiene. Cleanliness was spiritual, not physical. The body was seen as a vessel of sin, and caring too much for it raised suspicion. Hygiene drifted to the shadows of civilization, and with it, millions of lives. A 12th century monk once wrote, "He is clean not who washes, but who prays." That phrase came to symbolize an entire era. Showers, soap, disinfection, clean underwear. These either didn't exist or were treated as suspicious habits, more fitting for pagans or libertines. But it wasn't always that hopeless. In the early Middle Ages, Roman bathing traditions still lingered. Public baths operated in towns of the Frankish Empire. Monasteries had their own small bathhouses. Saint Isidore of Seville even urged the faithful to wash their bodies before prayer. But by the 11th and 12th centuries, Europe entered a new era, an era of fear. Fear of water, fear of the body. The main reason? A belief that water opened the pores, letting in disease. After bathing, the body was naked to bad air. And according to the miasma theory, bad air was the main carrier of plagues. So, when the Black Death came, even washing the face was forbidden. Instead, people were advised to wrap themselves in layers of filthy clothes, to seal every hole in the skin. In the 14th century, the University of Paris officially declared, "Water opens the way to death." Bathing became dangerous, especially for women. Hygiene was called a luxury, or worse, an act of vanity. In the year 1311, Pope Clement V issued a decree, "Modesty is greater than cleanliness. The body should not be exposed, not even in the bath." Bathhouses were shut down, or converted into brothels. In London, bathhouses on Southwark Street ran as disguised brothels. In Nuremberg, by the 15th century, nearly every public bath included special services. A new belief spread: cleanliness leads to sin. The result was terrifying. People stopped bathing. For years, a lifetime might pass without a single bath. King Louis XIV of France bathed twice, once at birth and once before death. Queen Isabella I of Castile proudly claimed she had never washed since baptism. And those were monarchs. What about the poor? Instead of water, perfume. Noblemen poured rose water, vinegar infusions, or lavender spirits on their clothes and skin. Perfume was not for beauty. It was for hiding rot, pus, and sweat. Monks had Saint Benedict's water to sprinkle on themselves before Mass, not for hygiene, but for spiritual purity. Lice, fleas, and ticks were part of life. People didn't kill them. They lived with them. Clothes were rarely washed, only hung in the sun to chase out dirt spirits. Most peasants owned no underwear. Outer garments were worn for years, sometimes until death. Corsets, tunics, and chainmail were only removed at burial. A priest in England wrote in 1428, "I keep my louse close, closer than my wife." Cities were dirty beyond imagination. There was no sewage system. Waste was thrown directly into the streets. Urine, blood, animal guts, kitchen water, dead rats, it all flowed under people's feet. In 13th century London, a job existed called night pot thrower. At night, someone would shout, "Watch out," and empty their waste from a second-story window. Public urinals, called pissing benches, were just wooden planks with holes placed over rivers or ditches. In Paris, they lined the Seine. These poisoned the water, causing typhoid, dysentery, and cholera. Tooth care, almost none. People chewed on bark, ash, or mint leaves. The rich used powders, sometimes with menthol, but these often included sand, which damaged the enamel. Rotten, black teeth were common. Cavities were seen as punishment for envy. Bad breath meant you had a sinful soul. And women, their hygiene was a nightmare. There were no pads. Instead, they used cloth scraps, straw, sheep's wool, moss, even old paper. Often nothing at all. Menstruation was unclean. Some women were isolated during their periods. Monasteries banned nuns from attending liturgy during this time. For fear, they would darken the grace of God. Children grew up in filth. Peasants had no diapers. Babies were wrapped in dirty rags, rarely washed. They slept on damp straw, surrounded by rats. Infant mortality was high. No one was surprised. These babies were called unfit for life and buried without names. Even burials were unhygienic. Corpses were not embalmed. If the family was lucky, the dead were wrapped in cloth or placed in wooden coffins. During plagues, hundreds of bodies were dumped into mass graves. The stench was so unbearable that priests fainted. Monks held mint leaves under their noses to keep from vomiting. "Death smells like a city in summer," wrote Italian chronicler Giovanni Villani. Yet not all was lost. In the Islamic world, cleanliness was sacred. Washing was mandatory. Arab physicians like Avicenna emphasized clean hands, clean linens, and regular bathing. In Muslim Spain, more than 600 public baths operated. The irony. Christian conquerors later shut them down, calling them immoral. In Scandinavia, bath traditions never disappeared. Weekly bathing was a sacred ritual. Even Norse sagas include scenes of men fighting in bathhouses, proof of how central these rituals were. But in most of Europe, hygiene remained taboo until the 18th century. The Middle Ages taught humanity a cruel lesson. Ignoring cleanliness doesn't bring you closer to God, it brings you closer to death. From plague to leprosy, typhoid to dysentery, dirt followed disease like a shadow. Only centuries later did people realize a simple truth. Mercy begins with clean hands. Cleanliness is not pride. It is a wall against the plague, wrote a medical manuscript at Basel University in 1472. In the Middle Ages, childhood did not exist as we know it. A child was not seen as a person, but as an unfinished being, a future worker, servant, or soul to be disciplined. Children were born not to live, but to serve, to obey, to suffer, and hopefully to be useful to their family. At worst, they died nameless, buried under cold soil before even being baptized. Birth itself was often a horror. There were no anesthetics. The rooms were dark, the knowledge of medicine nearly none. Midwives rarely washed their hands. Women were tied down to prevent movement during labor. Some deliveries lasted for hours, some for days. Screaming was seen as sinful, so women had their mouths stuffed with cloth. If a baby died in the womb, it was removed in pieces. Many mothers did not survive, and neither did many of their children. Those who made it were baptized immediately, often by the midwife herself if a priest wasn't present, sometimes using urine, because holy water was not always available. They feared the child could die unbaptized and be lost to heaven. Most children did not live long. Half of them died before the age of 5. In medieval England, child mortality among poor peasants reached as high as 75%. But those who survived faced another hardship. They were not allowed to be children. Infants were wrapped tightly in cloth, arms and legs bound to prevent movement. This was called swaddling. It lasted for weeks or even months. People believed a child's body was too soft and needed to be shaped, or it would grow crooked. Babies were often left in these wrappings for days without being cleaned. Their skin festered, soaked in filth. Mothers rarely nursed their babies. Many children were given to wet nurses within days of birth. Some were raised by strangers for years, returning home only to find their parents were now strangers. For peasant families, work began at dawn and ended at night. A baby was a burden, something to be handed to God or to strict discipline. By the age of 6 or 7, a child was no longer a child. Boys went to the fields, girls to the kitchen. Some herded animals, some fetched water, some cared for younger siblings. Childhood ended the moment a child could hold something in their hands. In London, apprenticeships began at 8. In the villages of France, as early as 5. Upbringing meant obedience and fear. Beating was not punishment, it was the method. At home, in school, in church, the rod, the belt, the stick, even a poker from the fire were used to correct the soul. A child was believed to be born sinful, and pain was the tool to drive the devil out. In monastic schools, children stood for hours in front of walls of repentance for poor prayers. A German abbot from Trier once said, in the year 1342, "When a child feels pain, the devil leaves the body." The main subjects in education were Latin and submission. Children were beaten for not knowing a prayer, for messy handwriting, for falling asleep in class. Girls were taught almost nothing. Their education was preparation for marriage as a duty. By 12 or 13, many girls were married. By 15, they were expected to have children. Among the nobility, things were different, but not better. Children were sent to live in other noble households under strict discipline and harsh rules. Boys were punished for failing at swordplay or losing at chess. Girls were beaten for speaking too loudly or showing emotion. The worst fate was reserved for those born outside marriage. They were seen as children of sin. The sons and daughters of prostitutes, servants, and raped women were often abandoned or sent to monasteries, where they lived as unpaid servants. In 15th century France, they were called enfants oubliés, forgotten children. Their role was to serve silently and disappear without a trace. Still, not all was darkness. In some Benedictine monasteries, children learned to read, draw, and sing. A few physicians even advised not to beat children before the age of 3, claiming their brains were still fragile. Folk songs preserved gentle lullabies, where mothers sang of love and protection. But these were rare, small islands of warmth in an ocean of coldness. In 16th century Russia, a household guide called Domostroy gave simple instructions. Do not spare the child. If you do not kill it, it will grow. Beat it, and it will repent. If you do not beat it, the devil will take it. In the Middle Ages, a child was not yet a human being. It was raw material. And until it became useful, it could be punished, ignored, or lost. No tears, no name, no grave. Only with the coming of the early modern period would the idea of childhood as a unique stage of life begin to form. But during the long and shadowed centuries of the Middle Ages, to be a child was to endure a trial, and not all survived. A treatise from Burgundy, written in 1489, concluded with this chilling thought: a child is a fragile root. From it, a tree may grow or nothing, but if you do not strike it, nothing will grow at all. You probably won't want to eat after hearing this story, and maybe you won't be able to. Medieval food was nothing like the romantic feasts in movies. There were no juicy turkeys, no mugs of boiled beer, no fresh bread on the table. Most people lived on the edge of hunger. What they put in their mouths could be poison, rot, dirt, or just an illusion of food. Food was a weapon of the times. It often finished off the weak. A peasant in the 13th century might eat only twice a day if they were lucky. Morning breakfast was usually just a piece of bread soaked in sour milk or watered-down beer. Dinner was a thin soup made from cabbage leaves, but no actual cabbage. Sometimes it was rotten turnip, a piece of moldy cheese, or grain so bad even rats wouldn't touch it. What modern people throw away was a feast for peasants. Meat almost never. Even a pig kept in the yard was often sold to pay church taxes. If they did slaughter it, nothing went to waste. Skin, eyes, intestines, bladder, even the brain were eaten. Blood was poured into soups, creating a festive broth. One chronicler from Wiltshire, England, in the year 1317, during the Great Famine, wrote, "I saw a mother feeding her children porridge full of worms gathered from old barley." This was not an unusual sight. Cities were no better. Bread was baked with dirt, wood shavings, and bran to save costs. Sometimes they even added plaster or lime to make the bread look whiter. The worst problem was a fungus called ergot that infected the grain. Eating this bread caused a terrible illness known as St. Anthony's fire. At first, people suffered headaches and fever. Then came painful convulsions. Finally, fingers, toes, even genitals would rot away. In France, entire villages lost limbs. People believed it was a punishment from God, but it was actually poison in the bread. Milk was mostly goat's milk or watered-down cow's milk, often sour. It could stay in a jug for days without refrigeration. Cheese was covered with uncontrolled mold, which they thought was healthy. But that mold often carried deadly mycotoxins. If eggs were available, they were often eaten raw, cracked straight into the mouth. The yolks were sometimes green. Chickens were kept mostly for eggs, so old hens' meat was tough and dark, like rubber. It was boiled for hours until the water turned cloudy. That was considered a meal. Fish was smelly, dried, and rancid. Herring was imported in barrels, layered with rotten flesh and salt. If a barrel spoiled, they would salt the fish again. Rotten fish was served with vinegar to hide the taste of death. In 1394, Paris saw a mass poisoning during Lent from spoiled eel. Water, people were afraid to drink it, and rightly so. Rivers were open sewers filled with waste, animal guts, blood, manure, and dead animals. The Thames had floating horse heads. The Seine was full of urine and two-headed fish. Wells often had dead rats, frogs, or even dead babies. so everyone drank beer instead, children, adults, monks. The beer was weak, about 2% alcohol, but safer than water if it didn't spoil. Even beer was boiled in rusty pots, often made from moldy grain. Sometimes bird bones or insects floated in it. Nobody minded, they just swallowed it. Medieval medicine believed food had temperament. Hot food caused anger, cold food caused depression. So doctors prescribed terrible diets: raw meat for melancholics, red wine for too much bile, and torture of the bowels to drive out slime. One doctor suggested eating boiled hedgehog with vinegar to cleanse the stomach. Taste did not matter, only smell did. Noble kitchens heavily spiced food not for flavor, but to hide rot. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and saffron covered the smell of spoiled meat and were served to kings. A traveler in 1423 wrote, "At the Duke of Normandy's kitchen, they served game already crawling with larvae, but strong with the scent of cloves." Monasteries sometimes ate dried snakes ground to powder or cow brains as delicacies. In villages near the Pyrenees, people believed meat of a frog baked in dough protected against evil eyes. Often they just ate the meat without dough. In Northern Europe, ashes from ovens were used instead of salt to add flavor. In Scandinavia, animal urine was added to sausages for sharpness. On the Balkans, they made blood soup with turtle shells. In Prussia, people ate fried raven chicks with guts. In Italy, pigeons were stuffed with brain. But the greatest horror was famine, and it came often. Between 1315 and 1317, Europe suffered the Great Famine. After bad harvests, people ate shoe leather, moss, tree bark, cats, dogs, and even their own feces. There is evidence of cannibalism in Flanders, Bavaria, and Saxony. Chroniclers wrote, "A mother cut off her child's thigh and roasted it over fire, believing it would help the others survive." Monks chronicle from Cluny, 1316. Hunger was normal, and any food was a risk. Survival had no taste. It had smell, mold, rot, and the danger of dying from what you swallowed. Next time you eat bread, imagine if it had mouse droppings and poison fungus inside. Medieval food did not nourish. It tested people, and not everyone passed alive. A medieval family was not a safe haven. It was a system of control, social pressure, and strict hierarchy, where blood rarely meant love. What today we call domestic violence was then considered normal. A duty, a sacred task. The father was like a god. The mother was a servant. Children were burdens. Women were property. Marriage was a contract, often deadly. Marriage in the Middle Ages was an agreement, not love, not a meeting of two souls. In France, girls could be betrothed at the age of 7. In Byzantium, at 3. In Saxony, as soon as a child could walk. This was seen as an early gift to the husband. I accepted Sir Arthur's daughter as a future wife for my son. She was delicate and silent, exactly what is needed for obedience. Read a letter from the Lancaster archives from the 14th century. Marriages were arranged without the consent of the bride or groom. In Poland and Bohemia, there was a custom of sealing the girl's mouth with cloth during the wedding ceremony so she could not refuse. In Germany, women could be sold with their dowry, like cattle. In Scotland, wealthy men bought the right of the first night, jus primi noctis, meaning that on the first wedding night, the girl had to sleep with the lord, not her husband. In Bulgaria and Serbia, there was a practice of wedding beatings. The bride and groom were whipped with rods to drive out demons. If the bride cried, it meant she would be a good mother. If she laughed, she was a scoundrel. The woman's role in the family was to bear children and be silent. Literally, in many parts of Europe, wives were forbidden to speak in the presence of their husbands. In 14th century France, it was customary for women not to sit at the table until the man had finished eating. In Normandy, a wife could not drink from the same cup as her husband, as it was considered mixing bodies. In some English villages, a wife could only speak to her husband through an intermediary, a son or mother-in-law. In Franconia, now part of Germany, women after childbirth were confined to a barn for 40 days so as not to defile the house with blood. There they lived among livestock, rubbed themselves with ashes, drank river water, and did not wash. The father had the right to punish, and he did. In Sicily, there was a family sword law. A man could kill his wife or daughter if suspected of adultery and face no punishment. In some Italian cities, there were 2 strikes rules. A husband was allowed to beat his wife twice a day, but no more. In Flanders, women were punished by having their teeth removed for being too talkative. "I hit her because she argued, and her tongue is longer than her skirt," said a record from a domestic murder investigation in Bruges in 1389. The verdict was nothing wrong. In rural communities, children were regularly beaten with rods, sticks, belts, and nettles. It was believed that a child was a demon, and the sin had to be beaten out of them. In English monastic schools, hot irons were used to distract from sinful thoughts. In France, children were tied to beds at night so they would not masturbate. Sexual relations in the family were governed not by love but by the church. Spouses could not touch each other during Lent, which lasted nearly 200 days a year. They could not have sex on Sundays, holy days, Fridays, before communion, after the death of a relative, or during pregnancy. There were even sexual instructions for honest families. According to the 15th century treatise De Coidu, a man should not look at his wife during intercourse because it tempts him. The only allowed position was missionary style, and only at night. If a man did not finish for conception, it was considered murder of sperm. In Norway and Iceland, spouses had to confess sexual details separately. The priest asked, did he hold her legs? Did he touch her breasts? Did he move his hips? Did he see her skin? Based on this, fasting or punishment was assigned. Raising children was done through fear. Babies were often left alone. They were tied to wooden benches with ropes so they could not crawl. They were fed leftovers from the table, sometimes moldy. In years of famine, children drank water infused with bread dust. Toys were not given. In 15th century France, a popular toy was a mummy, a dried mouse wrapped in cloth. In Prussia, there was a blood doll made of fabric soaked in bull's blood. In Portugal, children played with bird skulls strung on a string. A child is not joy, it is an obligation. And until it can work, "It is a mouth that eats," said a village pastor in Catalonia in 1471. Old parents were burdens. In some regions, especially the Carpathians, Lebanon, and the Caucasus, there was a practice of voluntary fasting of the elderly. When grandparents became unable to work, they were denied food. They were isolated in separate rooms and slowly starved to death. This was considered honorable. In Germanic tribes as late as the 11th century, there was a tradition of throwing the elderly into a river when they turned 60. If they survived, it meant they could still live. If not, the gods took them. Love was rare, but it existed. Like a mother's love for a baby she hid under her skirt to prevent it being taken to a monastery. Or a son who gave all his property to buy his father's freedom from church servitude. But these were exceptions, not the rule. The medieval family was not about sentiment. It was a machine for reproducing bodies, property, and power. A drama where roles were assigned until death, and not always voluntarily. In the Middle Ages, education was not a right. It was a privilege. Sometimes it was even a punishment. Often it was a false promise. Where today people are taught to think, back then they were taught to be silent. Knowledge did not open the path to freedom. It led to punishment, to burning, to betrayal. The educated were either monks or demons. Let's start simply. Most people could not read at all. In Europe, the literacy rate among peasants and townspeople between the 13th and 15th centuries was less than 10%. In France, only 4% of women had any idea about writing. In Hungary, a person was considered educated if they could read their own name, but not write it. In many regions, people believed that knowledge was harmful to the soul. In Transylvania, for example, it was thought that the ability to read opens doors to devilish communication. In England, the saying went, "He who reads is dictated to by the devil." The Bible was not for peasants. Its language, Latin, was secret, monopolized, and inaccessible. No need for books for children. "A book is a jester stealing obedience," said a village priest in Spain in the year 1432. Schools, they existed, but not as we imagine them today. In most regions, schools were monasteries, and what they called learning was memorizing psalms. They studied the Our Father prayer, Latin grammar, a few phrases from the Bible. That was all. No science. No philosophy. Any question asked without permission was considered the sin of arrogance. In Portugal in the 15th century, there was a school of humility where children were taught to be silent. They were forced not to speak for weeks because words were the source of sin. In Germany, monastery schools were called correction chambers. Children were kept in dark rooms. Food was given once a day. The lesson was daily copying of a prayer 300 times. In Wales, children were taught by beating their fingers with a stick if they confused letters. In France, they used a belt made of bull's hide called the discipline of God, the whip of God. In Bulgaria, Serbia, and Wallachia, education had a clear goal: to make you a copy of your father, nothing more. If the father was a weaver, the son had to know knots, not letters. In Lithuania, a child's educational skills were judged by their participation in rituals. If a boy learned the rain spell well, he was educated. In the Moscow Tsardom, secular writing was banned for a long time. Only church writing, Cyrillic for the Bible, existed. Literacy for trade or for science was punished. In 1551, the Stoglavy Council practically introduced restrictions on private education. Everything had to be under church control. Women, forget about it. In Italy, a woman who could write was often suspected of witchcraft. In Krakow, girls who showed interest in books were sent to monasteries or married off, so they would not meddle with knowledge. A literate woman is a storm in the house. She reads, so she judges. And judgment should be made by the man, said a Polish statute in 1418. In France, women had no right to attend schools until the 17th century. In England, only daughters of the aristocracy were taught etiquette, not knowledge. In Scandinavia, girls were taught to spin, sing ritual songs, and be silent. Universities? Yes, they existed, but they were another trap. The University of Paris, Bologna, Oxford, Prague, all were closed clubs for men of the clergy. The education lasted 8 to 12 years, but the content, knowledge revolved around scholasticism, tiring and pointless debates on things like, can God create a stone so heavy that he cannot lift it? Even medicine was studied not on bodies, but on books, often made up. Anatomy was learned from Galen's 2nd century book describing the internal organs of a pig. Human bodies were forbidden. Those who performed dissections risked their lives. In 1315, the first official dissection in Bologna was both a sensation and a scandal. Students fainted. Priests prayed for the soul of the corpse. Astronomy, forbidden. The earth was the center of the universe. Everything else was heresy. When in the 15th century rumors about Copernicus's teaching spread, star maps were publicly burned in Prague and Mainz. In Portugal, a man who taught children to count to 100 was suspected of alchemy. They locked him in an iron mask and kept him in a cell until death. Teachers, they were not defenders of knowledge, often the opposite. In village schools, the teacher was judge, executioner, and priest at the same time. If a child did not memorize a prayer, they were made to kneel on peas or beaten with a rod or deprived of food. In Denmark, it was recorded. The teacher held an iron rod with which he wrote letters on the board, then beat the students on the backs with it. In Britain, one way to learn spelling was to engrave letters on a wooden stick and force the student to lick it. If wrong, the stick was used to beat the tongue. The main rule, thinking was forbidden. Education did not teach critical thinking, it killed it. Learn what is said, not what you think, said the school code of Burgundy in 1467. It was believed that the mind was the enemy of faith. If a student asked why, the answer was because God said so. If asked again, the student could be expelled, beaten, or sent to a monastery to correct the spirit. Medieval education was not light in the head. It was darkness with a cross in hand. It was not a path to progress, but a wall with a message in someone else's words. Do not think. Do not ask. Repeat. Believe. Medieval cities were not stone walls and proud knights marching through squares. They were rotten. A living, stinking organism where thousands of bodies crowded narrow streets only about 8 steps wide, and the air was so thick it could be cut with a knife. The city did not breathe, it rotted. Every alley had its own smell. Death, dung, dogs, urine, rotten fish, human skin, and pig's blood, all together. No exaggeration. An anonymous city chronicle from Cologne in the year 1381 said, "The city is a wound. It festers, but everyone is used to the smell." First, there was no real sewer system. If anything existed, it was only in the richest areas near castles or monasteries, and only to drain rainwater. In regular neighborhoods, every house had a chamber pot or wooden bucket. People dumped the contents right onto the street. Urine, feces, menstrual remains, vomit, all thrown from windows with the warning, "Gardez-vous," meaning watch out. If you didn't get away in time, it was your problem. In English cities like York or London in the 13th and 14th centuries, streets were covered with manure and animal remains slaughtered right in the yards. Underfoot were guts, brains, eyes, dried blood mixed with horse sweat and human waste. In summer, heat made all this boil, and a thick, stinking fog hung over the streets, seeping through cracks in wooden walls into homes. Fleas, lice, mice, rats, and worms were full-time residents of every street. The urban poor often slept on the bare ground in common houses, sometimes right next to cows or goats. In Paris, at the beginning of the 15th century, every third house kept pigs inside rooms because they fed on garbage and provided warmth. But these same pigs sometimes trampled children to death, which was considered sad but natural. In 1379, in Toulouse, a pig killed a crawling baby in the mud before the house. The mother was drunk. The animal was publicly executed, hanged by its front leg as a warning. Dead bodies were part of the city landscape. They were not removed immediately. If someone died without relatives, the corpse could lie on the street for hours or days. Sometimes bodies were thrown into wells to deepen the sin. After plagues, especially the Black Death, streets became mass graves with hundreds of rotting bodies. The chronicler Jean de Vaux wrote, "In the year 1348, on the 3rd day of the plague, I went to the square in Beauvais. 46 bodies lay there. They poured vinegar over them and covered them with sawdust. Children played on top. In Naples, poor dead were thrown into caves outside the city, but neglect caused some bodies to be collected in abandoned city cellars." Over time, worm infestations began to appear on the streets, crawling from basements under the feet of citizens. Drinking water was a source of poisoning. Most city water came from rivers, which were also used to dump all kinds of waste. In Amsterdam in the 15th century, people caught leeches from drinking wells and sold them as medicine. In Nuremberg, water was so full of organic dirt it was filtered first through the cloth of the dead, because it filtered better. There were milk windows, places selling milk in clay cups that were not washed for years. Often, human urine was added to the milk to scare away evil spirits. City baths were not places of cleanliness. They were centers of infection, prostitution, and rituals. Water was changed rarely, often once a week. Sometimes dead mice, worms, and clots of menstrual blood were found in the tubs. But people came every day, not to wash so much as to relax. In Krakow, there are records of a bathhouse where women were rubbed with vinegar and pig fat, and all the residue was poured into the city ditch. The streets were full of endless processions of cripples, the blind, lepers, syphilitics, and mentally ill. They walked, shouted, hit themselves on the head, and rang bells. People gave them rotten fish scraps or bitten pieces of bread. In Florence, there was a street where 120 lepers lived, forbidden to be touched, so the disease would not spread, but also not to anger God. People threw alms to them on hooks, like feeding animals. Public executions were favorite entertainment. In central squares, gallows, fires, and scaffolds stood. In Cologne, Mainz, and Toulouse, executions were family events. Beer, pies, and songs were sold. Afterwards, children took burnt bones for luck. A Swedish traveler wrote in 1494, "I was shocked to see a child pull a human finger from the ashes and hold it like a trophy. Her mother laughed. Beggars and children were constant victims of violence. Street gangs of 8 to 10 boys attacked travelers, cutting purses and gouging out victims' eyes so they couldn't identify them. In Vienna, kidnapping children for cannibalistic sects was common. As reported by the Inquisition in 1477. At night, the city became a lair of evil. No lights, no guards. Only torches, screams, livestock cries, prostitutes, moans, monks, prayers, barking stray dogs, and the rustling of rats digging nests in rotting piles of trash. The medieval city was no romance. It was a wound that never healed, and you did not just live in it, you rotted with it every day. We often imagine medieval nobility as the peak of culture. Refined manners, silver goblets, graceful bows, the chime of brass and crystal. But behind the castle facades, behind the patterned wallpapers and perfume bottles, something very different hid. Darkness, rot, and the human body in its most unpleasant reality. A knight may be clad in gold, but under his chainmail pus flows. From the private diary of monk Gottfried of Auxerre, 1293. Let's start with Hygiene because it reveals a lot. French and Burgundian dukes believed bathing was dangerous. They thought water opened the pores, allowing the devil or disease to enter. So they avoided washing. Wealthy lords changed their shirts instead of bathing. Wearing clean linen on a dirty body was a sign of nobility. They rubbed the linen with fragrant herbs or sprinkled it with arsenic to kill parasites. In Prague, in 1402, at a royal ball, every third noble had lice falling from under their clothes, causing several ladies to faint. But this did not lead to change. On the contrary, a real man should have a strong smell, said the Duke of Brittany, France, 1387. Rotting teeth and foul breath were normal. Nobles rarely cleaned their teeth. In England, people chewed wood or wool soaked in wine. In France, some aristocrats rubbed their teeth with ash from human bones, believing it passed on noble energy. In Italy, sour goat urine was used to rinse the mouth, hoping for holy disinfection. The results were decayed gums, lost jaws, holes in the roof of the mouth from which pus oozed. The Duke of Milan smelled so badly from his breath that his favorite had to wear a linen scarf soaked in vinegar. Recorded by the court physician in 1416, physiology had no shame. Nobles urinated in fireplaces, in room corners, even from their chairs. At gatherings, it was customary to have a urine pot under the cloak, so the lord could relieve himself without standing. Women wore special long aprons that allowed them to urinate standing, even during dance. In Germany, at the wedding of the Count of Wurtemberg in 1451, one lady gave birth right on the dance floor because she thought it shameful to miss the fun. Food was a farce of death. Banquets lasted 6 to 12 hours. They ate everything: swans, peacocks, turtles, lizards, even cats, stuffed with dates and nuts in France. Food was dyed with poisonous pigments, cinnabar, copper, animal blood, to look bright. In Sicily, bread soaked in the blood of the executed was served, believed to strengthen the spirit. At Charles the Bold's palace in Burgundy, servants were forbidden to cook without a fragrant mixture of meat from 3 animals and human brain, as the Duke believed only this summoned divine power. Incest was unpleasant but common. To preserve pure blood, marriage between cousins was the rule. In Castile, Spain, some nobles married their nieces or even half-sisters. In Bohemia, a count openly raised his future bride, the daughter of his sister, feeding her with his wife's milk to preserve the family's energy. I love her because I know every mole. She is from my root and therefore true. Count Ottokar von Sternberg, 1477. Noblewomen were victims of harsh customs. They were sewn up after childbirth to convince their husbands of returning virginity. Some were forced to wear iron chastity belts that grew into the skin. In France, one countess died from infection because her belt lock was not opened for 11 months. Blood, sweat, and semen were considered beauty elixirs. French noblewomen rubbed their skin with menstrual blood of young girls to restore the blush. In 15th century Spain, there was a practice of bathing in men's semen collected from servant rooms. In Germany, countesses painted their lips with worm fat mixed with ash from the hair of the sick, believing it protected from aging. Indoor castle toilets were open holes above moats. Waste fell directly into the water, where thousands of flies bred on dead bodies. In summer, moats turned into black-green swamps that smelled for kilometers. There are stories of servants falling into these pits, drowning because they descended dark stairs without candles. When the Countess of Savoy went to pray, one page fell into the filth. They never retrieved him. They placed a cross on the shore. Monk Jerome, 1368. Entertainment was gilded cruelty. Dogs tore apart cats, jesters ate snakes, half-alive chickens were roasted on spits and doused with wine. Peasant children were forced to crawl on knees through thorns to amuse the guests. In Denmark, Lord Rank held an annual hunting of the disabled, chasing them with dogs around the yard. Death was always near. Exhausted by syphilis, gout, leprosy, impotence, nobles covered ulcers with powder and rotten limbs with golden cloth bandages. Some ate charcoal to hide the smell of their bodies, and the richest wore wax noses to cover lost parts of their faces. Nobility did not shine, it rotted. The stench mixed with wine, blood with rouge, and all this was called high society. In the world of the Middle Ages, where the smell of decay was more common than the scent of incense, and funerals were grand events like carnivals, death was no longer seen as a tragedy. It became a ritual, an art, even a fashion. In medieval Europe, death did not hide in the shadows. It was raised on shields, kissed, painted, honored, and collected. People feared it, but at the same time wanted to touch it. Sometimes literally. Whoever touches the skull of a saint shall not know sin. Whoever breathes in the smell of a martyr's body shall keep their soul forever. Papal Decree, Rome, 1291. Let's start with relics, the biggest market of dead things in the world. Every self-respecting town had to have at least one bone of a saint, but there were not enough saints for everyone. So traders dug up any bones, rubbed them with herbs, burned incense on them, and claimed they were the finger of an apostle, the rib of a martyr, or the hair of the Virgin Mary. In Paris, during the black market of the 1380s, you could buy the nail of Saint Jerome, actually a chicken bone lightly polished, the tear of Mary, a drop of old wine vinegar, the head of John the Baptist, one of 3 such heads kept in different abbeys at the same time. In Germany, dried tongues of martyrs were popular. People wore them in small cases on their chests. They would lick these during prayers, believing it passed blessings. Some of these tongues were real, human tongues dried with salt and urine, preserved for decades. In an abbey near Naples, Italy, they kept the mummified skin of a nun. Pilgrims came to kiss it and rub it on their teeth, believing the skin was so pure that it could cure infertility. Funerals were not about saying goodbye. They were performances of death in all its smells and colors. In France, noble families competed to see whose body could stay unburied the longest. Some displayed the dead person for 20 to 30 days in special coffins with windows. Soft fabrics wiped away the corpse's sweat, and wounds were covered with powder to avoid frightening guests. In Venice, in the year 1412, the body of a noble lady lay on a balcony for 34 days, surrounded by flowers, candles, and girls singing in a choir. At night, servants cleaned maggots from her eyes and nose, and rubbed her mouth with oil and gold dust to keep her smile alive. Among the nobility, a ritual called marriage with the dead was common. If a bride or groom died, the other could marry the body. The ceremony was like a real wedding, with vows, a kiss, and the wedding night next to the body. In France, by an order of King Louis X, nobles could legitimize children conceived before the wedding by such unions. In Lorraine, eastern France, there is a recorded case of an 11-year-old girl marrying the corpse of a 49-year-old count, who died one day before the ceremony. The body was carried on pillows, and the head was held straight by a metal rod, which was later removed and given to the widow as a symbol of preserved marriage. The art of death was a whole craft. So-called memento mori, reminders of death, were in every castle. silver-framed skulls, cups made from pelvic bones, musical instruments made from the skin of executed criminals. In Poland, at Piskowa Castle, a countess had a piano covered with human skin and told guests which keys came from which criminals. Corpse cosmetics were a fashionable trend. In Germany, ladies bought face masks made from corpse water, a liquid collected from dead bodies in hospitals. It was stored in silver vials mixed with rose essence and applied to the face for eternal beauty. In Spain, a popular cream was made from baby brains and ground pepper, used by noblewomen as foundation. In Scotland, people believed that the soul could be caught. After the death of an important person, windows and doors were sealed with cloth to keep the soul inside. Servants ran around with candles and jars trying to catch it. The breath of the soul was considered healing. Sick people breathed it in or added it to medicines. We caught the spirit of the Father in a bottle and keep it hidden. It still whispers like the wind. Monastery Record, Scotland, 1449. Public executions were the high points of the cult of death. People loved, waited, and celebrated them. They brought children, sold pies, and made noise. Bodies of the executed were not always removed. They were left to hang on ropes to scare criminals. In Frankfurt, Germany, in 1471, the body of a robber hung for 8 months, and people came to pray under it, believing his bones took away sins. There are known cases when crowds tore the body of the executed into souvenirs. Hair, pieces of fingers, bones from legs. People believed that the blood of the executed is the strongest amulet against poverty. But the most terrible rituals involved children's bodies. In Switzerland, in the canton of Ticino, there was a practice of nights of mourning, when a dead child was placed in the center of the house, and the family spent 3 days in complete silence with it. The father had to drink wine mixed with the baby's blood, and the mother ate part of the placenta as a symbol of acceptance of death. This was done publicly. There were dances of death, theatrical performances where living people played the dead, and skeletons played violins. These were farces, but with real props. Bones, coffins, real ashes sprinkled over the hall. In London, at the monastery of St. Catherine, an annual carnival was held where people dressed as corpses and held weddings of the dead. Often someone died afterward from infections, because masks made from corpse skin were not sterilized. The Middle Ages were not afraid of death. They dressed in it, breathed it, sang with it. The corpse was an object of pride, ritual, and even love. Perhaps that is why these people survived in such a harsh world, because they learned to live alongside what today makes us lose sleep. From the dead, one can take more than from the living. Posthumous note of a monastery treasurer, 1428. Imagine a world where the word justice meant pain, fear, and fire. A time when the church was not just a place to pray, but the court, the police, and the executioner. That world was medieval Europe, and justice back then was a spectacle soaked in blood and silence. Close your eyes and picture a small village in the 14th century. It's night. The air is cold, and somewhere a child cries. Suddenly, A torch flares in the dark. A man in robes arrives with soldiers. They grab someone from their bed, a woman. Someone said she talks to plants too much. Or she didn't attend church last Sunday. Or her bread rose too well. It doesn't matter. She is now accused of witchcraft. She's thrown into a cold cell. The days that follow are slow and cruel. Torture begins not because they want truth, but because they want a confession. Her screams are not heard because they are expected, because justice in this world screams. The Inquisition was not just a group, it was a machine. Started by Pope Gregory IX in the year 1229, it was meant to hunt heresy beliefs that challenged the Church. But soon it became a weapon. It spread across France, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Germany. It reached the New World. In Mexico and Peru, the fires of the Inquisition burned just as hot. Torture tools were not just instruments, they were inventions of horror. The Spanish tickler was a metal claw used to rip skin. The iron pear was a metal object inserted into the mouth, which expanded until the jaw broke. The Iron Maiden, a metal coffin with spikes inside, didn't always kill immediately. Sometimes it kept people alive for hours, bleeding slowly in darkness. Water torture was common. A person was forced to drink until the stomach nearly burst. Then they were pressed to vomit, then made to drink again, over and over for days. The body swelled. The mind broke. This was called the water death. And all of it was public. Executions were like theater. Crowds gathered. Children sat on shoulders. Sellers sold pies and beer. In France, people watched as a man had his hand cut off, then his head, then his body burned. In Germany, a thief's belly was sliced open and sewn to the city gate as a warning. In England, during the 15th century, some were hanged, and molten lead was poured into their mouths. Women were often the main targets. A woman with knowledge of herbs, a healer, could be killed as a witch. A woman with too much voice, too strong, too loud was dangerous. In Portugal, the bare skin torture was used. A woman was locked inside a metal cage shaped like an animal with sharp spikes. If she moved, the spikes cut her. And so she had to stand perfectly still until death. Children, too, were not safe. In 16th century Venice, if a child stole bread or disobeyed, they might face drying torture. They were tied to a wooden frame and left under the sun with no water for 3, sometimes 4 days. Their lips cracked. Their skin peeled. Their eyes burned from the light. This was done to teach others fear. Often there were no trials, no proof. A neighbor's word was enough, or a dream, or simply envy. The Church said that to doubt the Inquisition was to doubt God, and who would dare? Those who spoke for the accused were often arrested too. Silence became survival. People whispered. No one trusted anyone. The Inquisition didn't need truth, only obedience. Behind many tortures was profit. When someone was declared a heretic, their property was taken, often by the church or local lords. This made accusation a business. In Spain, the infamous Grand Inquisitor Tomás de Torquemada oversaw the deaths of thousands. His Inquisition became a system of fear that ruled for over 3 centuries. But the most chilling part, The people believed they were doing good. That burning a body saved a soul. That pain was a path to heaven. The church even had special prayers to bless torture. Some inquisitors kept relics, blood-stained ropes, teeth, bones, and called them holy. Some torturers were rewarded with land, or gold, or rank. The Inquisition spread even to the colonies, to the Americas. In Lima, in Mexico City, people were burned under the same laws. Justice traveled by boat with swords, chains, and holy books. At times, the Inquisition burned books, music, paintings. Anything that suggested free thought. Even laughter could be dangerous. They feared anything new, because new ideas brought doubt, and doubt was poison to power. In some cities, people were forced to wear black crosses if they were once accused. A mark forever, even if innocent. By the 18th century, the Inquisition began to fade. But its shadow stayed. Its silence, its terror, its memory still echo. Today, we look back and wonder, how did this happen? How could anyone believe that pain was holy? But the truth is simple. Fear is powerful. And when power wears the mask of faith, it can make good people do terrible things. So next time you hear the word justice, remember, not all justice is just, and not all fire brings light. Alchemy in the Middle Ages was not only about the noble search for truth, the elixir of life, or the transmutation of lead into gold. Behind the golden glow and elegant manuscripts stood a darker truth. Dirty, bloody, often foul-smelling and unbearable by today's standards. Alchemy advanced not only through intellect, but also through fanaticism, despair, human cruelty, and a chilling indifference to the suffering of others. For every formula that survived into our time, there were corpses, broken minds, poisoned lungs, and destroyed lives. At the heart of medieval alchemy were laboratories, but not like the ones shown in movies. These were poorly ventilated cellars filled with sulfur smoke, the fumes of nitric acid, rotting corpses, and sometimes the cries of the living. Some alchemists experimented with human remains, blood, fat, urine, and feces. They believed that creating living gold required living substance, so human tissues and fluids became ingredients in their experiments. In Central Europe, alchemists used a substance known as mumia, a powder made from mummified bodies, often stolen from Egyptian tombs or from paupers' graves. It was mixed with other components to create so-called healing ointments. In France, there was a black market for mummified criminals, executed in public squares. Their fat was melted down and used for mercury-based ointments or as a base for potions. At noble courts, some alchemists specialized in poisons. This gave rise to so-called alchemical murders, slow poisonings using compounds of mercury, arsenic, or antimony. In Italy and Germany, some were suspected of aiding political assassinations under the cover of experiments. In some cases, alchemists received fresh bodies directly from executioners. These were used to observe how the soul leaves the body. Experiments could be terrifying, from dissecting still living victims to injecting acids into veins. One of the most disturbing obsessions was the idea of creating a homunculus, an artificial human. Some recipes claimed it could be grown in a glass container. One such method required human sperm sealed inside a horse's womb, kept warm for 40 days. Alchemists believed that from this mess, a small human would emerge. In reality, it meant slaughtering animals, filling their bodies with human biological fluids and watching them rot. In England, the alchemist George Ripley, one of the most respected in the 15th century, wrote about a mixture called living mercury, made from lead, urine, snake blood, and woman's milk. Whether he tested it himself remains unknown, but followers took his writings literally. Some monasteries reported the disappearance of newborns or bodies shortly after burial. Not all were blamed on thieves. Alchemists sometimes worked secretly with monks who believed that forbidden knowledge could bring enlightenment. In Florence, Italy, a 13th century underground lab was discovered. It contained remains of at least a dozen stitched-together bodies, likely part of an experiment to create the perfect body, as described in alchemical myths. Excavations in Transylvania uncovered a 15th century lab with more than 60 jars. Inside were ashes, bone dust, and toxic substances. Many alchemists believed that gold was born from decay. "Gold is born in rot," wrote one German alchemist. The search for the philosopher's stone, the pinnacle of alchemy, often consumed its seekers. Alchemists drank their own creations, believing the mixture would either kill them or reveal the truth. Many died in spasms, their faces blackened from lead or antimony poisoning. It was said that if a potion killed instantly, it was impure. But if one could endure the pain, vomiting, and bleeding and still survive, the substance might be divine. Some alchemists knowingly sacrificed others. Servants, slaves, and the mentally ill were used as test subjects. They were fed metal solutions, given mercury vinegar, or had their skin treated with poisonous creams. In Spain, Inquisition records tell of an alchemist who tested his formulas on 16 girls from a brothel. Only one survived. Fanaticism reached religious madness. In Austria, a monk alchemist cut off small pieces of his flesh each day and dripped his blood into a glass vessel, believing only his suffering could purify the substance. His body was found 2 years later, bones shattered, skin torn from years of self-torture. Rivalry among alchemists was ruthless. Formulas were stolen, labs were burned, and those suspected of lying were imprisoned or executed. In Prague, one alchemist was bricked alive into his own cellar by order of Emperor Rudolph II, who believed the man had discovered the secret of gold and refused to share it. His body was found 2 centuries later. In the end, the glory of alchemy led to its downfall. Too many lies, too many deaths, too much senseless pain. Yet from this hellish mix of metals, flesh, fear, and knowledge, a science was born, the science of chemistry. The price was terrible: human lives, moral decay, the cheapening of the body. And yet, in the heart of this horror, alchemy gave humanity more than just dark legends. It laid the foundation for the light of reason. This is not a fairy tale about wizards and the philosopher's stone. This is rot that became the soil of science. In the Middle Ages, epidemics were not just medical disasters. They were social earthquakes, religious tests, and cultural traumas. Disease shaped history, destroying cities, toppling empires, and leaving deep scars in the memory of humankind. The most terrifying of all was the Black Death. This plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, arrived in Europe in the middle of the 14th century. It started in Asia and spread westward along trade routes. One of the first places in Europe it reached was the Crimean port of Kaffa, now called Fetishism. During a siege of the city, Mongol forces catapulted the bodies of plague victims over the city walls, an early act of biological warfare. From there, Genoese traders fleeing the city carried the disease on their ships, unknowingly delivering death to ports across the continent. The symptoms were horrifying. First came a high fever, chills, muscle pain, and vomiting. Then came the buboes, painful swollen lymph nodes that grew under the arms, in the groin, or on the neck. These could swell to the size of apples. They throbbed, burst open, and released pus, blood, even maggots. The skin would often darken due to tissue death. This gave the plague its other name, the Black Death. There were different forms of the disease. The bubonic plague attacked the lymphatic system. The septicemic form poisoned the blood, and the pneumonic form infected the lungs. It spread through the air. People could die within 1 or 2 days. They coughed blood, gasped for air, and often died in terror. Blood streamed from their eyes, ears, nose, and mouth. Their bodies twisted in pain. Some tore at their own skin, begging for death. Everywhere the plague arrived, life collapsed. In London, more than 500 people were buried each day in mass graves. In Paris, carts filled with bodies rolled through the streets. Corpses were tossed into trenches or into old wells. In many cities, the stench of death filled the air. People fled in fear. Families abandoned their homes. Entire neighborhoods were sealed shut. In some cases, when someone inside showed signs of plague, the door was nailed closed. The sick and the living were left to die together. Treatment was desperate and often cruel. People believed the disease came from bad air called miasma. Some burned herbs, wore amulets, or carried sweet-smelling flowers. Others cut themselves to let out bad blood. Some rubbed their skin with snake fat, pig grease, or even ashes. In one case, they filled the nose with ash, believing it might purify the brain. Plague doctors wore masks with long beaks filled with lavender, rosemary, and mint. They rarely touched patients. They gave orders from a distance. Sometimes they applied leeches. Sometimes they used fire. But mostly they watched people die. The poor died in their huts, surrounded by filth, rats, and waste. Rich people locked themselves in their villas, but even behind marble walls, death found them. Servants carried the disease on their clothes. The plague did not care about money or status. One Venetian merchant wrote, "My daughter, dressed in gold, lying in velvet sheets, dies just the same as the butcher's children." The plague does not ask how many florins you have. In Florence, when a sick shopkeeper died inside his store, the authorities sealed the door with boards. They left the body inside, along with the goods. In Marseille, witnesses described how hundreds of bodies were thrown into the sea. In one monastery in France, 90% of the monks died. And then came fear's cruel shadow, blame. Many thought the plague was punishment from God for human sin. In some towns, religious fanatics marched through the streets, whipping themselves until blood ran from their backs. They cried for forgiveness, but spread the disease further. Others blamed the innocent. Jews were accused of poisoning wells. In Toulouse, Strasbourg, and Barcelona, entire communities were burned alive. People were tortured to confess crimes they never committed. It changed nothing. The plague kept spreading. And it wasn't only the Black Death. Other plagues tore through medieval Europe: leprosy, smallpox, dysentery, tuberculosis, typhus, and syphilis. Lepers were locked in colonies and left to rot. Smallpox left survivors disfigured. Dysentery made people vomit their own intestines, dying in pools of their own waste. There was also the mysterious English sweat in the 16th century. People collapsed within hours. Their skin melted like wax. Villages vanished. Monks and nuns died by the thousands. One chronicler wrote, "The dogs tear flesh from children who still breathe. I saw a mother drop her crying baby and run." In noble homes, the panic was no less cruel. When the child of a duke died in London, her body was covered in honey and placed in a crystal coffin, hoping it would protect the others. The next day, 6 more children died, along with 3 maids. At the same time, poor people lay dying in alleyways, clutching a mug of wine or a piece of bread. The plague did not choose. Rich or poor, saint or sinner, everyone rotted under the same stained blankets. From Venice to Lisbon, from Bruges to Prague, the whole continent carried one smell of death, of filth, of burned flesh. People didn't just die. They vanished into fire, into mud, into silence. Whole generations disappeared. And yet, out of this horror came something else. Slowly, painfully, people began to change. The plague broke feudal systems. It forced rulers to improve sanitation. It made medicine question tradition. Some cities began to keep records. Some doctors began to learn. Death had shaken the world. And through the ashes, humanity began to see itself anew. No schoolbook captures all of this. But these are the true faces of the Middle Ages, rotten, brutal, and forgotten. Epidemics didn't just kill bodies, they changed everything. And maybe, just maybe, it's a miracle we are still alive. In the Middle Ages, cloaked in the black hood of religion, shame, and superstition, sexuality lived a double life. It was officially condemned, yet secretly desired. It was allowed, even supported, and in some places formally institutionalized. Few things captured this contradiction better than medieval brothels. Contrary to the popular image of hidden, underground sin, brothels were often located right in the heart of cities, near markets, trade routes, and even churches. In London, for example, legal brothels operated under the protection of the church. They were overseen by the Bishop of Winchester, and the women who worked there were mockingly called the Winchester geese. These women lived under strict regulation, when they could work, how they should dress, and even what colors they were allowed to wear. Red hoods or specific belts marked their unclean profession. In Paris, the city authorities permitted brothels in districts like Boberg and Marais. Women there could even obtain official work permits. But the conditions they endured were often horrific. Damp stone rooms, no ventilation, straw instead of beds. In some of the city's rougher neighborhoods, a room was merely a wooden screen and a piece of cloth. In German cities such as Nuremberg, prostitutes lived together in large halls, sharing mattresses, food, and taking turns to serve clients. Medieval prostitution went far beyond today's ideas of sex work. Sexual services could include brutal practices, beatings, acts resembling ritual violence, even staged scenes mimicking black masses or role plays of priests and nuns. These performances were especially popular among the wealthy elite. Fetish play was widespread. Bathing in wine, tying women to posts like supposed witches, or hosting orgies in honor of saints. One brothel in Genoa, in the early 14th century, had a special room where men would lock themselves in with 2 or 3 women to perform purifying rituals. Through humiliation, these practices reveal a darker side of medieval sexuality, one steeped in the desire for control, pain, dominance, and degradation. And through all of it, the Church was often not just complicit, but directly involved. While it condemned extramarital sex as a mortal sin, many clergy secretly used, and sometimes even owned, brothels. Monasteries kept mistresses under euphemistic titles like widows. In France, priests in Arras were known to organize orgies with underage girls from nearby villages. In some German monasteries, abbots officially allocated part of their budget to support these companions. Medieval laws themselves were often grotesquely absurd. In Barcelona, authorities allowed brothels to function only if they offered free services 1 day a week for the poor, meant to calm the urges of the lower classes. In Bologna, women were examined weekly by city-appointed doctors to check their integrity. If a woman was found to be too promiscuous, she was publicly whipped. Church-imposed sexual bans were no less extreme. Every sexual act outside of marriage was a mortal sin. Oral sex, a crime against nature. Anal sex, a sodomite offense punishable by burning. Masturbation, a loss of life force believed to cause leprosy. Even marital sex was considered sinful if it wasn't done in the sacred position. Sex during religious holidays, forbidden. During Lent, absolutely not. Still, when you read Inquisitor reports from the time, the list of sinners often included nearly 1/3 of a city's adult population. Life in brothels was fragile and humiliating. A pregnant woman was expelled. If she caught syphilis, she was locked in a house of the afflicted. Death from venereal disease was common, and in cities like London or Venice, prostitutes were buried in special cemeteries like Cross Bones or Isola del Lazaretto. And yet, brothels did not disappear. On the contrary, they became part of the urban fabric. Students, merchants, craftsmen, priests, and knights visited them. In medieval Italy, there was even a saying, "Before taking up the sword, visit temptation." In some places, young men were officially encouraged to go to brothels before marriage to calm themselves before joining with a virtuous woman. This strange blend of morality and hedonism religion and indulgence, fear of eternal damnation, and lust for the flesh turned medieval sexuality into a theater of absurdity. A theater where hypocrisy was the curtain, behind which the darkest instincts of the era burned brightly. And this theater, for all its prohibitions, lived on breathing, earning, and leaving behind pages of history that are painful to read, yet impossible to ignore. In medieval Europe, exorcism was more than just a religious ritual. It was a mirror that reflected the deep fears, beliefs, and power struggles of that era. These ceremonies were often public events where religion, medicine, and politics danced together in strange and tense ways. They were meant to drive demons out of people's bodies, but they also revealed much about how society viewed sin, sickness, and control. One of the most striking cases was that of a French woman named Elizabeth de Ranfang. In the year 1618, she claimed to be possessed by demons. Her case attracted attention from both religious leaders and government officials. After several years of exorcisms, which lasted until 1625, Elizabeth went on to found a shelter for women leaving prostitution. This transformation from a victim of possession to a founder of a moral refuge shows how exorcism could sometimes help people re-enter society in new roles. But not all stories ended with hope. In the town of Aix-en-Provence in 1611, several nuns reported being possessed. A priest named Louis Gaufridi was accused of causing the possession by making a deal with the devil. He was tortured and then executed. This case became an example for other future witchcraft and possession trials, including the infamous trial of Urban Grandier in the town of Loudun. In 1647, in the town of Louviers, another mass possession occurred. This time, again, it involved nuns, and the exorcisms were performed publicly, in front of entire communities. These events were both religious acts and a kind of social theater, bringing people together or tearing them apart. Not everyone believed the claims of possession. In 1599, a woman named Marthe Brossier came to Paris, saying she was under the control of demons. However, doctors, including the personal physician of King Henry IV, declared that her symptoms were fake. This marked the beginning of a growing skepticism about exorcisms, and pointed to a new role for medical experts in judging such cases. Sometimes, the exorcists themselves were accused of wrongdoing. In the year 1517 in Modena, Father Guglielmo Campana was put on trial for using superstitious and forbidden methods during exorcisms. In 1642, another exorcist named Geminiano Mazzoni admitted to using inappropriate techniques, including sexual acts, during rituals. These shocking stories remind us that exorcism could be abused for personal gain, manipulation, or worse. By the end of the 15th century, guidebooks for exorcists began to appear. One of them, called Conjuration of Evil Spirits, helped formalize how exorcisms were done, and tried to draw a clear line between holy practice and superstition. Another book, published in 1502, also gave instructions on how to question the devil and expel spirits from possessed people. These texts tried to make exorcism more serious and more standardized. In Protestant countries like England, exorcism was practiced too, but in different ways. Puritan ministers such as John Darrell performed exorcisms, even though some Puritan leaders, like William Perkins, were against such rituals. This shows how Christian traditions disagreed with each other, even on the idea of fighting demons. Throughout the Middle Ages, exorcism was a complex and powerful force. It reflected not only the religious beliefs of the time, but also the fears and hopes of ordinary people. It was a way to make sense of suffering, but it was also a tool of control over women, over the sick, and over anyone who didn't fit the accepted mold. In a world without modern science or psychology, exorcism offered both explanation and solution. Even if that solution could be cruel, dangerous, or tragic, the rituals were loud and emotional. People screamed, fainted, twisted their bodies. Crowds watched in silence or shouted prayers. The smell of incense filled the air. Priests chanted in Latin. Holy water was splashed on faces. Sometimes the exorcised person would shake violently, speak in unknown languages, or describe visions of hell. All of this made the exorcism not just a spiritual act, but a dramatic experience that burned itself into the memory of everyone present. Even today, echoes of these old rites remain. The Catholic Church still trains official exorcists. Some people still believe in possession, but now many cases once seen as demonic are treated by doctors and psychologists. What was once seen as a battle between angels and devils is now often seen as mental illness or trauma. Yet, the fascination with exorcism remains strong in books, films, and stories, perhaps because it touches something deep inside us, something ancient, fearful, and mysterious. In the Middle Ages, the word hysteria was much more than just emotional excitement or a nervous breakdown. It was like a sentence, a curse, something impossible to understand, and therefore to fear. A woman who convulsed, screamed in an unknown language, bit herself, pulled her hair out, or laughed without reason was not seen as sick, but possessed. Men were believed not to have this female weakness. For church leaders, hysteria was either a punishment or the entrance of Satan into the body. Medicine, as it was imagined then, was more a theater of suffering than a way to heal. The word hysteria comes from the Greek word hystera, meaning womb. Hippocrates, long ago, suggested that a woman's womb could move through the body, pressing on organs and causing convulsions, suffocation, blindness, or even madness. In the Middle Ages, this idea was accepted with fanaticism. Hysterical symptoms were thought to happen only to women. And by the 17th century, this belief was firmly rooted in medical theory. But the truth was different. Behind hysterical attacks often hid depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, epilepsy, dissociative disorders, or consequences of sexual violence and repression. Yet in a world without psychiatry, hysteria became a mark of a dangerous witch, a reason for exorcism, or grounds for torture during interrogations. Imagine a monastery in France in the year 1450. A young nun named Marguerite begins to suffer from nightly attacks of fear and trembling. She wakes up screaming. People see her in fits of ecstasy, her body arching like a bow. She is thought to be either blessed or possessed. In both cases, she is isolated. Candles are placed around her, prayers are read, and when the attacks do not stop, a priest is called. Without hesitation, he begins the ritual of exorcism. Marguerite convulses violently. 4 people hold her down, pour holy water into her mouth, rub oil from the relics of Saint Dominic onto her body. But nothing helps. She is chained to a wall in a dungeon. She stays there for 9 months until she dies. The diagnosis is hysteria. The cause is the devil's influence. One of the most famous cases of mass hysteria happened in the 14th century in a monastery in Quedlinburg, Germany. Dozens of nuns began to dance, scream, tear off their clothes, and even imitate sexual acts with invisible forces at the same time. Modern researchers think this might have been caused by extreme stress, hunger, harsh discipline, and possibly a shared psychological reaction to fear and repression. But at that time, it was called a demonic invasion, a reason to interrogate nuns on their knees, accusing them of witchcraft. Hysteria symptoms appeared in many forms: temporary blindness, sudden loss of voice, an uncontrollable urge to undress, sing, or jump. In London in the year 1385, a woman named Agnes Bardell was arrested in the marketplace for dancing, laughing, and throwing clumps of earth at people. She claimed she saw God giving her prophetic visions. After 2 days in a dark cell with a bucket of stagnant water, she was taken to St. Ursula's monastery. There, she underwent steam treatments, sitting over a cauldron of boiling herbs. A local healer rubbed a salve made from bloodwort, wine, and crushed flies on her belly. She had 15 sessions. On the 16th, she died from infection. A common treatment for hysteria was inducing orgasm. As strange as it sounds, medieval doctors, especially in Italy, believed that womb spasms could be relieved by stimulating the sexual organs. Either doctors themselves or specially trained servants performed these treatments behind closed doors, under the secret name female massage. They thought that rhythmic rubbing could make the womb return to its place. Of course, there was no scientific basis for this. Poor women with hysteria were often accused of witchcraft. Over 100 documented cases exist where women were burned at the stake simply for behaving inadequately, howling at the moon, crying too loudly at funerals, or saying they heard voices. The story of hysteria cannot be told without mentioning the dancing plague of 1518 in Strasbourg. More than 30 people began dancing in the streets non-stop, day and night, for weeks. They fell from exhaustion, convulsed, and some died from heart attacks or dehydration. Authorities called doctors, who blamed excess of hot blood. The treatment was to encourage more dancing. They built stages and hired musicians so that the sick could release demons through their bodies. Modern medicine tends to see this as psychogenic mass hysteria, a collective reaction to hunger, pressure, and fear of epidemics. But in the Middle Ages, it was simply called possession. Conditions in hospitals for such patients were worse than prisons. Walls were sprinkled with holy water, floors were bare, and patients were chained. In Spain, monasteries often funded these hospitals, so treatment was mostly religious. Daily prayers, confessions, and obedience to the priest. In France, patients underwent bloodletting, leeches, vinegar enemas, or even hot oil. In Germany and Switzerland, terror therapy was used. Patients were locked in dark rooms filled with bats or hung with mummified skulls. By the 15th century, a woman with hysterical attacks could become either an object of religious cult or a victim of demonic panic. Saint Catherine of Siena reportedly had visions, ecstasies, and bodily spasms, but was considered a saint because she was from nobility. Meanwhile, Maria from Beaumont, a peasant woman with similar symptoms, was beaten to death by a mob who thought she was a witch. Medieval hysteria is a story of female bodies that were feared, misunderstood, and controlled. It is a story of pain hidden under mysticism, of medicine that tortured more than healed, and of a world so dark that the slightest nervous breakdown could mean a death sentence. At the same time, it is a story too close to our own, where the same fears have only changed their form. Flesh, dust, and passion. Fetishism in the Dark Ages. In the Middle Ages, where God watched through rotten stained glass, and the devil hid in the folds of confessors, every breath could be a sin. People lived with the constant awareness that the body was a prison, and desire was the fastest road to hell. But in these decayed basements of fear and shame, something even darker was born. A hidden sensuality that grew like mold on the walls of monasteries, like mice in the floors of brothels, like rot in the skull of a saint. People were forbidden to look at the naked body, so they dreamed of it. Hands, faces, necks, everything had to be covered. And because of this, even one bare finger could cause an uncontrollable fever in the eyes. The body of a saint, dismembered and divided across churches in Europe, was kept in golden reliquaries like the most precious treasure. But these pieces of holiness were not only objects of worship. People touched them with a trembling that was hard to call purely spiritual. A bishop from Avignon in the year 1273 wrote in his diary, "A woman fell to her knees before the glass reliquary holding a tooth of St. Paul and rubbed her breasts against it for a long time. It was disgusting, but also touching." Fetishism grew from superstition, from pain, from loneliness, and from boredom. In the cities, beggars sold cut pieces of monks' clothing, sometimes stinking, sometimes with remnants of skin or hair. People not only hung them above doors for protection from misfortune, as they said out loud. In dark corners, they sniffed them, licked them, whispered prayers that closely resembled excited moans. One witness in the city of Chartres described a man who breathed in the scent of the garment as if swallowing the soul of its wearer and trembled as if seized by a fit. But the greatest stage for fetish was executions. People flocked to the squares like flies to dung because blood and death gave them a vivid sense of life. Hanging women were especially popular. The executed witches left behind items, nooses, ropes, strands of hair. These were stolen. These were collected. Some believed that if you put a piece of the rope used to hang a witch in your mouth, you could become a man without fear. But there were also those who masturbated while smelling her scent. One can imagine a young executioner's apprentice returning from the gallows with a stain of semen on his pants. He did not understand what was happening to him, but wanted it again. Because at the moment when the body becomes a corpse, something strange and sweet opens, bliss forbidden even in thoughts. In the year 1381, a secret room was discovered in a monastery in Trier, a cave beneath the library. There, 20.5 phalluses made of wood, bone, and wax were kept. They were painted, decorated with tiny crosses, and one had wings and bore a name written in gold, Peter. It turned out monks did not use them for science. In the confession of one monk it was written, "I understood God through pain and the sin of the flesh, for only then does the heart tighten and the abyss open." Thus was born the cult of pain. Flagellants, sectarians who whipped themselves in the streets, often pretended it was repentance. But witnesses saw something else in their faces, a gleam in their pupils, sweaty bodies moving in a rhythm close to orgasm. Chronicles mention a woman in black who followed the flagellants and masturbated in the sleeve of her dress, biting her teeth with each blow. In noble castles, secret passions were also hidden. There were rooms where artifacts were kept, decorated vaginas cut from the bodies of prostitutes and embalmed, underwear with holes for a better entrance of the spirit, masks made from the faces of servants who died of the plague. Their mouths still showed signs of pain, but their eyes were closed as if in eternal consent to everything. Rituals were held there where people became dogs, where men prayed in poses resembling bodies pierced by arrows, martyrs. All this is not fiction. Historians unafraid to dig in dirty archives find evidence. Manuscripts where monks described dreams in which Jesus appeared with female breasts. Engravings where angels licked the heels of saints with their tongues. Candles shaped like penises were sold near churches for fulfilling vows. The Middle Ages were not a time of childish naivety or holy darkness. It was an era when fetishism had no word but had many forms, and all of them lived alongside God. Because God, as people imagined then, could be a strict father, a bodily lord, and a lover of the soul. And the more he forbade, the more people desired him through tears, pain, the smell of sweat, holy flesh, and sweet death. They all lived in one world that smelled of rotten bread and holy wax, where every touch could become a curse or a blessing. Fetishes were everywhere in monasteries, where monks quietly whispered prayers, and simultaneously touched the knots on their belts with mysterious trembling. And in village huts, where women reached for the old boots of a dead husband to feel his strength, and men kept squeezed rapeseed leaves in their pockets, because they believed they attracted wealth and desire in women. In the dark corners of craftsmen's workshops, the smell of sweat mixed with wax and leather. Every worker had a small shrine, a piece of old cloth, a worn glove that touched the palm of a city priest, or a tuft of hair from a master who once touched a girl's hand. These things, hidden in secret places, became objects of undisguised passion. To touch them meant to enter a world of forbidden desires. At night, craftsmen made figures resembling parts of the body, covered them with wax, and left traces of their fingers. Women wore amulets, small statues shaped like genitals made of wood or stone, hidden under dresses, sure they could awaken a man's lust or protect from evil spirits. Sometimes these amulets served as symbols of enmity, sometimes of passionate play. In one village, there was a legend of the Black Girl, who had a cloak made of owl feathers so powerful that when touched, the heart beat wildly and the body trembled as if with the strongest passion. People told stories of strange cults among the lowest classes, where women smeared their genitals with tar and wore them as talismans, where men broke dishes to pour out their aggression, and then collected the shards because they believed the souls of their lovers lived in them. This was a society where the boundary between holiness and filth blurred every minute. Religious hierarchy harshly punished the smallest signs of bodily joy, but at the same time produced fetishes itself. For example, black mastic, a thick medicinal mixture applied to the skin for healing, became an object of lustful fantasies. Priests in masks hiding traitors and secret sinners walked in churches, and some pilgrims recognized in these masks the faces of loved ones long dead. Touching them, they felt genuine fear and excitement. The strongest fetishes among peasants were objects that once belonged to the dead. It was believed that through them, one could gain their power, but also their cursed soul. In a mountain village, there was a tradition to collect the nails of the dead and carry them in cloth bags tied to their belts. When the bag was removed, they listened to the silence, believing they heard the whisper of souls. Sometimes this whisper turned into a dream where eyes flashed in dark forests, those who wanted to take the living with them. Fetishism here was not only about desire, it was a survival mechanism in a world where death lurked at every step. Everything from a piece of wool to an old rope was both a talisman and a curse. They carried the smell of disease, sweat, and blood, but also hope that life followed behind, rotten but still warm. Especially cruel were rites of passage into adulthood, where young boys and girls were taught not to be ashamed of their bodies, but not to show them to anyone except the chosen. These secret lessons took place at night, in abandoned churches or basements, where people gathered in strange masks and animal skins to perform rituals that forced touching of body parts that later became sacred fetishes. Sometimes these rituals ended in blood and tears, sometimes with laughter and screams, and sometimes with silent acceptance of fate. Fetishism was in every breath, in every glance trying to hide from God and people. People kissed pieces of cloth wrapped around the hands of martyrs and felt their own bodies flutter from a hidden fire. In this, shadow hid the filthiest desires and the greatest need for holy love. In the Middle Ages, fetishism was not just attachment to things or body parts. It was the embodiment of fears and desires mixed in a foul stream of flesh and spirit. History preserved many testimonies of how different social layers developed their own special rituals, which today we would call perversions, but then were reality, though hidden behind the veil of religion or superstition. One of the most terrible forms of fetishism was the cult of bodily remains of martyrs and saints. Not just relics, but fragments of flesh, pieces of bones, and sometimes even blood considered holy and magical. In the 12th century, in the Abbey of Saint Denis in France, a part of a saint's rib was kept, a kind of magical talisman. But this rib was not just a bone. Legends said monks who touched it felt a strange pulse, as if the bone were alive and breathing. Religious fanatics kissed the rib, licked off the dust, and did not shy away from sinful thoughts that broke through forbidden prayers. In cities, craftsmen honored their materials, leather, hair, even feces that accidentally got on work tables. They believed that through these, the power and essence of life passed. It is known that guilds of shoemakers and tailors had secret places where pieces of old leather with traces of the bodily presence of noble clients were kept. It all smelled of mold, sweat, and the feeling of the deepest taboo, to touch and feel that you merge with their flesh. Peasant fetishism showed itself in the simplest but terribly deep forms. For example, there was a tradition to collect hair of the dead, especially children, and weave amulets from it. These balls of hair were hidden under doorsteps, believed to protect from evil spirits. But often women touched them with such deep longing that they faced condemnation or treatment in monasteries. There is evidence that some peasant women slept with these amulets, pressing them to their breasts, and whispered prayers to the souls caught in the hair. The Middle Ages were a world of contradictions, where God and devil coexisted, where sin was both feared and desired, and where fetishism was both a curse and a secret salvation. This history is a window into the dark rooms of human desire, where flesh, dust, and passion intertwined in a dance as old as time itself. In the Middle Ages, death was not just an end, but a horrific drama unfolding in the harshest details. Every death was a spectacle filled with blood, pain, and endless cruelty that consumed both body and soul. History has preserved hundreds of stories where the body became a stage for unimaginable torture. And death was like a fierce music of hell that everyone, from the poorest peasant to the king, witnessed. One of the cruelest punishments was leaving the dead body in a public place, to rot in full view. The smell of decay mixed with the scent of human blood soaked into the clothes and skin of passers-by. People's eyes caught every detail, flies buzzing around torn flesh, silent screams trying to come through barely moving lips, and the body swelling as if the earth itself was swallowing the soul. The most brutal death was considered the public breaking on the wheel, a terrible ritual where the victim was slowly stretched on a large wheel, breaking bones and tearing muscles. Blood flowed in streams, mixing with dust, and the skin ripped open, showing shining bones through the holes. People gathered around, greedily watching this dance of pain and death, sometimes laughing loudly or crying with horror. The smell of burning and death spread far beyond the city. In prisons, where bodies were already broken, physical torture was combined with spiritual torment. Prisoners were chained in iron collars that cut into their necks and shoulders, forced to sit in cold dungeons filled with their own waste and blood. There was a recorded case in a monastery prison where a prisoner, forced to stay for months in a tiny cage, lost his mind and began biting his own body until only bones covered with hardened skin remained. One of the most terrifying ways to die was burning at the stake. Victims did not just burn, they merged with the fire in agony that lasted minutes or hours. People saw how the skin cracked, muscles and internal organs bubbled and melted, and the screams of the condemned cut through the night, leaving echoes in the minds of those watching. Burning bodies twisted slowly in incredible convulsions. Every breath felt like the last explosion of pain. Equally cruel were deaths by quartering, when the body was cut into 4 parts, which were then hung on posts around the town, turning the body into a terrible symbol of power and obedience. These pieces of flesh fluttered in the wind, smelling of blood and rot, while passers-by's eyes moved over them with both horror and fascination. Deaths in the Middle Ages also included body robbery, when graves were dug up to steal valuables, but often parts of bodies were taken for magical rituals or fetishes. Legends tell of grave robbers who cut off fingers and ears from the dead, collecting living parts that seemed to speak words from another world. Their hands and lips kept weak, trembling movements even after death, as if trying to say one last thing. Animals in medieval towns, stray dogs and rats, were not only carriers of disease, but also participants in this horrible spectacle. They tore apart dead bodies, leaving marks of their sharp teeth and claws on the skin, adding more fear and horror to local legends. Some believed that animals eating corpses took part of the soul and returned it to the living world as ghosts or curses. But the most terrifying death was the one that came in complete loneliness. Among the stench of rotten vegetables and unnoticed dungeon walls, where screams faded in cold darkness, and people died in their own horror and despair. Their bodies remained invisible, their deaths forgotten. But the atmosphere of these places kept the smell of fear, sweat, and human blood that could no longer find peace. A famous case of torture and execution was that of William de Liff, an English bishop of the 13th century. Accused of treason, he was subjected to the hellish squeeze, a technique involving slow crushing in a steel suit that tightened the body step by step until bones cracked and breath stopped. The servants who carried out the execution remained indifferent, listening to bones breaking and the skin tearing with a disgusting crunch. Witnesses described the bishop's body as dry and like a skin wrapped tightly around a bone frame. His last words were rude curses. The silence was impossible. In 1391, in France, one of the cruelest executions took place. The breaking on the wheel of Pierre Moreau, accused of witchcraft. He was tied to the wheel, and bones were slowly broken. But the most terrible part was that he remained alive for several hours, begging for death and screaming hatred at his executioners. People gathered in the square not only watched, but also burned wood nearby, filling the air with the smell of burning flesh and fear. When the wheel stopped turning, his body was cut into parts and hung around the city as a warning to anyone who dared stand against the power. There was also a case in the city of Nuremberg in 1476, where a woman named Eva Hessler was executed, accused of witchcraft and corrupting young boys. Prisoners were tied by their hands and feet to trees, and boiling resin and hot oil were poured on them. Her body burned, the skin peeled away in strips, and the smell of burning flesh spread for miles. Hessler not only screamed from pain, but also tore her throat with every breath, causing even greater horror among the crowd. After her body was put out, the bones were burned, and the ashes scattered over the river to take her soul away. The Tower of London prison was not only a place of imprisonment, but also a stage of incredible torture and death. One of the most famous cases was the death of Thomas More, sentenced for treason. His head was cut off with a sword, and this moment caused a mix of fear and awe among those present. But the worst was that before execution, More was kept in damp dungeons, where he lost consciousness from lack of air and cold dampness, trying to bite off the chains that squeezed his hands. The bodies of other prisoners were often left in the dungeons for years, rotting in their own filth, attracting rats and insects, which added to this terrible ecosystem of death. Executions of heretics were especially cruel, as they were considered cursed from birth. Witnesses described how, in Vienna in 1425, 19 heretics were slowly burned alive at the stake, holding small wooden crosses that melted in the heat. Their bodies burned, and screams lasted until dawn. Locals believed the souls of the burned did not go to heaven, but spun in circles of hell, eternally suffering for their sins. Not less cruel were executions of enemies of the people in rural areas, where for the smallest offense, stealing food or even mourning, one could be punished publicly by the whole village. In one village in Germany in the 1350s, a man was tied with ropes and drowned in a swamp, leaving the body to float for days as a reminder of submission. Local children were afraid to approach the place, hearing noises and voices seemingly coming from the swamp.